Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're reviewing the new Black Panther album. When it comes to massive artists of, this decade, that I feel like years from now, decades from now, we're going to look back on this decade and think to ourselves, who are the big artists from this decade that are just have pretty much cemented their place in history for the quality of their music. I think easily towards the top of that list, if not at the top of that list for me, would be Kendrick Lamar. He's easily one of the biggest artists out there, both in terms of popularity and the quality behind his music. He has both the popularity and the quality to really back up anyone claiming that he's one of the biggest artists out there nowadays. And when it comes to this new Black Panther, I guess you could say it's music inspired by and used in the film itself, which just a fair bit of warning, I haven't actually seen the film yet. I don't think it's actually going to be released into theaters here in the United States for a couple more days as of when I'm recording this review. But yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but then again, given the artists that are on this album, it's pretty clear they were going for a bigger soundtrack to this thing that they were hoping people were going to listen to on its own, separate from the film itself. So I think it's pretty fair to judge this thing on its own without the context of the film that it's attached to, even though I am guessing that some of these songs are tied into the film itself, if not, used in the actual film itself. And of course, hearing them in the context of the film, which I am eventually going to see, I'm actually really excited to check out this film, but hearing some of these in the context of the film, if they're used in the film itself, might change my perspective on some of them. However, just listening to this thing on its own as an album, I think that, I've developed some pretty, important points I want to make here in this review. And, having this whole thing done kind of by Kendrick Lamar, kind of having him be the guy, kind of pulling the strings on this project, I guess you could say. I think that was a wise choice, kind of like I was talking about before, given just how massive an artist he is. He was going to, ensure that there was some quality material on this album and that it was going to have commercial appeal to it as well. And I'm hoping that to an extent that this thing does have some commercial appeal to it. I do know some of the songs are getting some popularity to them, so let's hope that keeps things up. Because overall, I have to say that this project is decent. I don't think it's necessarily an album that I'm going to be coming back to repeatedly as a whole or anything like that, because I do think there are some cuts on here that aren't, quite up to the quality of some of the other better tracks on here, but overall there are some good cuts on here, in fact some great cuts on this thing. And throughout this album, while it does feature a wide array of artists on it itself, Kendrick Lamar kind of plays the role of, I guess if I had to compare it to another artist or something, I would say it's Kendrick is to this album kind of what Damon Albarn is in like a Gorillaz album to an extent, without all like the rock and other just genre elements that are kind of thrown into Gorillaz albums, just kind of a strictly hip-hop sort of album. But Kendrick kind of plays a similar role. On some of these songs he has pretty big roles where of course he's rapping and things of that sort, but on some of these other tracks he just kind of has background vocals, or maybe he's just doing the hook. His presence isn't quite as strong, but just throughout this thing he is a presence throughout the entire album. Even when he isn't the showcased artist on the particular track, his presence is still there, but it's not quite to the levels of this being a Kendrick Lamar studio album or something like that. That's not what this album is. He does have some tracks on here that are credited as being Kendrick Lamar songs, sometimes shared with other artists, but overall it's not a Kendrick album in the same way that his other studio albums are. But if you're a Kendrick fan, you probably are going to like a lot of what's on here. I do also really like how this album kind of has a bit of a pacing to it of its own, with lots of these movie soundtrack tie-ins that have been done. Lots of times it's just a collection of random songs by an assortment of random artists that are just kind of thrown together. Not really much of a consideration put into the track listing really or anything like that. But that's clearly not the case here. I mean, first of all, having all the artists kind of being, from one particular genre, kind of having a similar style to them, that's going to help, for one thing, instead of just pulling from a bunch of different genres or something like that. I've heard some albums in a similar vein to this one do. But this album also, just outside of that, really has a sort of flow to it. I feel like there was a lot of consideration put into the order of the track listing here on this project. Like, I feel like there's a definitive start and end to this thing. It's not just a collection of tracks, which isn't really something that I felt like they needed to do. They could have just had this been a couple of, tracks thrown together with no real consideration put into the ordering, but they decided not to do that. So I give them props for that. I think that was a really good decision, and it makes this album feel a lot more complete and a lot more whole. But to start with some of my favorite tracks on this thing, the opening track, Black Panther, I think is a really solid song. It's really just, a Kendrick track, really the only track on here that's just Kendrick, and it's really just him rapping, and it's a great start to this project. Of course, given Kendrick's role in this project as a whole, I think it's only appropriate for the project to start out with him, and it's just a really solid song overall. If you like Kendrick Lamar, you're gonna like the Black Panther track. I also really like All the Stars with SZA. This is just a track that, it has a bit of a poppier edge, I guess you could say, to it, but I do really enjoy it. I think SZA has a beautiful voice here on this thing. Kendrick just, great as always on this. Definitely one of the highlights in my opinion. As is the closing track on this thing, Pray For Me, which is Kendrick Lamar and The Weeknd. Once again, The Weeknd's voice on this is just beautiful, and Kendrick's verse on here is great. It's one of my favorites on the entire album. And just Kendrick and The Weeknd together, they just make a really solid combo in my opinion, mixing the sort of R&B sound with the hip-hop. It just works very nicely. And it's a pretty nice closing track as well. It's probably my favorite track on this entire project. I think it's just a really solid cut overall. Another track I really like is Ops. I really like the beat on this song. It kind of has a sort of experimental feel to it that I really enjoy. Vince Staples sounds really great over this, and him over this production reminds me a little bit of his last album that he did, because the production on that was also a little bit experimental. It's not quite experimental in the same vein as that album was, but still, it's really cool to hear him and Kendrick on another track again, because they both sound really great here. The track also features Eugen Blackrock. I hope I'm saying that name correctly. I was unfamiliar with this artist before this album, whose verse I think is pretty good. There's just one little odd thing about it, that he mentions like Gotham City in his verse, which is kind of odd considering that this is an album tied into a Marvel movie, and Gotham City is Batman, which is DC. I mean, are they just that confident in themselves at this point, just compared to DC, that they really don't care if they're talking about DC stuff on their Marvel album? I mean, I just feel like that's really weird. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I mean, if there's ever a time to be referencing DC properties in your music, probably not on like a Marvel-themed album. But still, the verse itself was good, so I really can't complain all that much. While there are some really good songs that appear on this thing, and just some really solid highlights on this album overall, there's also some parts on this album that I'm not particularly, fond of, I guess you could say. Nothing that's really all too awful going throughout this thing. There's a couple of tracks that I feel like just aren't quite as interesting. They just kind of feel a bit more filler-like. They just really don't add too much in my opinion. And just really weren't all that much my cup of tea. Maybe some other people may like some of them, but maybe the album could have worked better if it was maybe a little bit shorter. The track The Ways is probably my least favorite in the entire track listing, just because it doesn't really do all too much for me. It's kind of a more modern, kind of R&B, trap influence type song, and I'm not the biggest fan of trap music personally. I do think there are moments where it's done well, including some moments here on this album itself and some other songs, but this track really just doesn't appeal to me in any way, shape, or form, especially Sway Lee's vocals. I'm just not a big fan of him really at all, his vocals, so yeah, that didn't really sit all too well with me, this track. I just really didn't care for it all too much. And then there's the track King's Dead, which is one I'm really conflicted on here on this album. That's just because the majority of this song I really like. I like the beat, I like a lot of the verses on this thing, but there's just one glaring problem with it, and it comes out of Future's verse on this thing. Now, if you couldn't guess from what I said earlier, with me not being a really big fan of trap music, you might assume I'm not really a big fan of Future, and to be honest, I'm not a fan of Future at all. I wasn't really looking forward to his verse on this thing. So when it starts up, it's nothing really that I'm impressed by. It's not anything super awful, and to be honest, if it was just that, I could probably tolerate it within the context of the rest of the song, and I still really like the song overall. But there's just one part on here where he tries to do this thing where with his voice he just kind of goes really high, like he's trying to sound like he's like a little kid or something almost, and it just sounds really ridiculous. Like, I'm not sure whether or not I want to cringe or laugh when I'm listening to it, but it just ruins the entire song for me. Like, I love most of the songs surrounding it. Like, the rest of Future's part of the song is, like, okay. Like, I can deal with it in the context of how great everything else is. But this one part just ruins everything. Like, I don't want to listen to this song again just because of that one part. And, you know, it's not often that I come across a song where, you know, I like most of it, but there's one little part that just ruins everything. And this is just one of those occasions. Like, I really can't enjoy this song. The track Big Shot with Travis Scott is another one that I'm kind of mixed on because I really like the beat of this track, but the actual rapping itself is just kind of meh in my opinion. Kendrick sounds a little bit annoying here on this song. I really don't care for his part all too much. Travis's part is just kind of okay as well. It's not awful or anything, but it's just kind of meh in my opinion. Overall, I have to say that Black Panther, the album, is an album that's, you know, decent in my opinion. There's a lot of great cuts on this thing, like some of the ones I was talking about before, that are definitely worth checking out. I think that some of the you know, featured artists on this album just happen to outshine others, and just some of the tracks on this thing you just don't really compare to some of the better songs, and it causes the album to drag a little bit at times, and at times just sound like, you know, bad, like during that future part I was talking about before, which is just probably the worst moment on the album overall. It's just really unfortunate that it comes during one of the better songs on the project, and just in terms of everything else in that song itself. But yeah, it's a decent project in my opinion. I don't think this album is gonna, you know, have a ton of, you know, lasting power or anything quite like that. Like I said, I think there's a good handful of songs on here that are really enjoyable, but there's also a handful of tracks that are either, yeah, you know, I really just don't care for all too much, and I don't really feel like I'll be coming back to all too much. But it's a decent project overall, I'd say. If you're a fan of Kendrick Lamar or some of the artists featured on this thing, you should definitely give this thing a listen because you'll enjoy at least some of it. But yeah, folks, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this review, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future music-related content like album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, all that kinds of stuff. Comment down below what were some of your favorite songs on this project. What did you think about the project overall? Follow me on all the social medias I have linked in the description down below. And thanks for watching, guys. Stay golden.